Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to pick up this question of the way in which this particular part deals with the bank account. So there'll be plenty more opportunities for Mr. Nash. We share and share alike over here, Jamie Lee Ross. Actually, what I'd really like is for Jamie Lee Ross to get up and take a call and tell the House why it is that every single person who is purchasing a home in New Zealand now has to provide a bank account number when the Inland Revenue Department, the people we rely on for the advice on this, told us it wasn't necessary. That's what they said. So in their regulatory impact statement, this is what the IRD had to say. They said that the requirement to have a New Zealand bank account to obtain a New Zealand IRD number is unnecessary for individuals and of limited benefit, as the Inland Revenue Department already has the power to require relevant identity verification upon application for an IRD number. So that was the advice of the Inland Revenue Department, and we heard before in part one of this bill the deep concern of government members about unnecessary, complicating bureaucratic processes being put in place. Terrible thing to have to provide an IRD number that you've already got, that you already use for a whole lot of other purposes. So very worried about adding layers of bureaucracy, adding complexity. But then they get advice from the Inland Revenue Department to tell them that it's completely unnecessary for people to have a bank account number, and they ignore it. Utterly confused. I actually honestly believe that members opposite don't really understand what's happened here. This was a rushed piece of legislation, just as the Bright Line Test Bill is a rushed piece of legislation, and I just don't think they got their heads around it. We had some pretty odd and interesting situations as amendments were proposed at various points in the process, and the officials went away to see if they could deal with them. It was a shambles, Mr. Chair, and this part two of the bill really is where the rubber hits the road in that regard. So let's be absolutely clear here. The Inland Revenue Department have said the provision of a bank account is completely unnecessary. And in fact, when people go to get an IRD number, there does need to be identity verification. And I would suggest, Mr. Chair, that it's actually somewhat more rigorous than just opening a bank account. Because it's pretty clear that if someone offshore is going to purchase a property in New Zealand, they'll get the bank account. It'll be the only thing it's used for is in order to get the IRD number. It won't actually be used for anything else. And perhaps unsurprisingly, banks may not be too worried about that. There'll be a little fee involved that'll be of some use to them, so they're not too worried about it. But actually, it is completely unnecessary, completely bureaucratic. And again, I want to refer, as colleagues have already done, to the submission of the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand. And they made the same point that the IRD made in their submission, that there is no assumption that there will be any greater assurance achieved in this process by looking to have a bank account number. It really does very, very little in regard to that. The second point made by IRD, and indeed made by the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand, is, and I'll just quote the IRD here, the IRD says it is not apparent that for individuals the general anti-money laundering checks that a New Zealand financial institution would carry out would yield significantly more information than the IRD collects as part of the current IRD number application process. So that is the process here, that there isn't actually any benefit, but there is significant additional burden of cost, burden of complexity, burden of bureaucracy. We're not achieving anything by having the requirement for a bank account number. And I'd simply, Mr. Chair, ask members on the other side to consider what it is that they're doing here. On one hand, we've been told that this is not about a register. It's not about providing that information. It's about making sure that people are paying the right amount of tax, as Louise Upston said. That's actually another bill. It's not this bill. And in this bill, it is about getting data. So on one hand, we're now not getting the comprehensive data that we should get because we're exempting the main home. But on the other hand, we are in fact, through this legislation, placing a burden on an unnecessary burden on people in terms of providing a bank account number. So, Mr. Chair, I want to hear from members of the government why it is they are imposing this when the Inland Revenue Department told them not to, when the Chartered Accountants told them not to. What do they know that those people don't? Because it's not clear to me, Mr. Chair.